It would be difficult to understate the importance of the panel we're going to have today. If you take a step back and you think about the impact, the strategic impact of the Syrian civil war, the truth is it would be difficult to find another event that has so transformed the region and has such strategic implications for every actor. The war itself has been especially bloody. It's probably one of the bloodiest civil wars in the region, and historically, if you look at civil wars. But think about what it did to Israel in terms of the conventional threat from Syria. Conventional threat is gone. The conventional army of Assad is destroyed. The chemical weapons capacity is a tiny fraction of what it used to be. Iran has changed its whole footprint in the region in no small part because of Syria. Russia has come back for the first time in decades. Turkey has now entered in mass in Syria, and it is not clear if it's leaving. The entire region is changing, and this is really an epicenter of change. Just think, one other thought experiment. In 2005, think about the total domination that Syria had of Lebanon. When the state of Syria collapsed, that changed Lebanon in an important, meaningful way. And this is almost reversed, that Lebanon used to be the playfield for Iran vis-a-vis Israel, and now it's through Syria. The quietest border has now become potentially the most dangerous from Israel's perspective. We could not have asked for three better panelists to help us understand the major implications for what we are seeing today than the three people here to my right. Let me start with Michael Singh, who's a managing director and Lane Swing Fellow of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Michael was previously Senior Director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council from 2005 until 2008. And previously, he was a special assistant to two Secretaries of State, Rice and Powell. He is recently the co-chair of a congressionally mandated Syria study group, which put out a report in September 2019. And Michael's a frequent commentator on outlets including CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. He's bipartisan in his commentary, and is published in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. To his right is Mr. Charles Lister, who is a senior fellow and director of counterterrorism studies at the Middle East Institute. He has focused primarily on Syria since 2011, but he's also a leading expert on jihadist terrorist organizations. Charles was previously at the Brookings Institute in Qatar and a senior consultant to the Syria Track 2 dialogue, where he interfaced with the leadership of over 100 opposition groups. He frequently appears in CNN and BBC, and like Michael has appeared, his analysis has appeared in the Washington Post, New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and others. To his right is Hevi Bouzo, who is a Washington bureau chief for Orient News. She's hosted the show The Axis, which is focused on Syria and Middle Eastern affairs, politics, and she's broadcast in over 60 countries. She's interviewed renowned American officials and politicians during her work in Washington, and was the first journalist from a Syrian TV network to share an Israeli perspective when she interviewed Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon. Prior to the US, Hevi was born and raised in Damascus, Syria, and she's been here continuously since 2009 and is a vocal opponent and activist about the regime. Myself, my name is Cameron Brown. I am the director of AIPAC AIEF in Israel, the AIPAC's office there. My background previously, I have a PhD in international relations, and I've worked at various research centers on Middle Eastern topics and issues of international security. So again, we have a really fabulous panel here. Of course, we have to start with what's most pressing in the news. I want to start with Idlib. You know, recently, if you look at the course of the war, Idlib is one of the last major fighting grounds. There have been hundreds of thousands of people killed in this war, roughly 500,000. But the Syrian push into Idlib and again, there's something like half the country is either internally displaced or refugees abroad. This round of violence could potentially lead to a whole new level of violence and destruction and change the confrontation. And now you add into this the recent confrontation between Turkey and Syria. So let's start with Michael. First of all, why do you understand that Assad is making the push he's pushing now into Idlib? There was a ceasefire that had been reached at one point. Why is this falling apart? What's going on?
Well, thank you, Cameron. First of all, let me say it's a real pleasure, as always, to be here at Policy Conference. What could be better than getting together with 20,000 friends from around the world amid a global pandemic? Please keep your distance. Especially auspicious that we are getting together on Israel's election day, or as we call it, Monday. That's all the jokes I have, I promise. So Idlib, a very serious topic and a tragic one, essentially because this is a tragedy that many of us have foretold now for a long time. This didn't take us by surprise. This isn't a shock to the international community. This is a case of something we knew was going to happen, we just didn't know when. And I think that's important to bear in mind because, in fact, so many foreign policy crises are like that. And so we might ask the question of why didn't we do more before today, before this tragedy actually struck? But I'll leave that question for now. So why now? Why is Assad now making a push on Idlib? My co-panelists who are more expert than I am on Syria will have their own views on this. But I think that this was, for Assad, a matter of something that he has long sort of wanted to do. The Assad regime, since it managed to sort of turn the tide against the opposition in the western part of Syria, and we should bear in mind, you said, Cameron, the last sort of fighting ground. I think that's optimistic because there's still a very large swath of Syria which is not under regime control, and even those areas which are under regime control, such as the southwest, are really only tenuously under control and frankly could be areas of renewed fighting. But there's no doubt that the Assad regime has been looking to try to retake territory that it lost to its opposition. And Idlib is, I think, a piece of territory that is particularly sort of stuck in the craw or stuck in the maw of the Assad regime. And it's been a particularly difficult target because it has been sort of surrounded by Turkish forces on one side, occupied by largely sort of, I shouldn't say occupied, controlled, let's say. It's occupied by innocents who have largely been driven from other places. It's controlled, or has been controlled, by these jihadist groups. And I won't kind of get into who they are at this stage. But they're ones that the United States considers dangerous that are also dangerous to the Assad regime. And so there's different reasons why the Assad regime would want to retake Idlib. As for why they decide to do it right now, I'm not going to venture to speculate, but as I said, maybe Charles and Habe have their own theories. I think regardless, there's three reasons why this is a particularly important battle in Idlib. Number one, because as I mentioned before, such a large number of Syrians had taken refuge from other places in Idlib, which means essentially that the humanitarian sort of impact of what's happening now could be tremendous. It already had a large population of displaced people. Those people are now being forced out of Idlib towards either the Turkish border or towards sort of other Turkish-occupied areas of Syria, and the extent of human suffering will be tremendous. Number two is because of those jihadist groups that I mentioned before. One thing that the U.S. government worries about, the U.S. military in particular, is that if those groups are driven from Idlib, they will scatter to other areas, either of the Middle East or perhaps even beyond the Middle East. And while we sort of know where they are now, they're relatively contained, even if they're difficult to reach for the U.S. military. We don't want to see their dispersal to other areas, and we don't want to see them shift to from caring about, say, the Assad regime to caring about targets in the West. Third, this, as we have seen, I think very clearly, is a piece of territory which brings Turkish, Russian, Iranian, and Syrian forces into close contact and therefore holds the potential for an even greater internationalization of the conflict than we've seen already. You described it, Cameron, as a civil war. I would protest that it hasn't been a civil war for a long time. In fact, this has been an international conflict of really sort of not unprecedented scale, but unprecedented for many years, I would say, certainly in the Middle East. This, I think, as we've seen, brings the possibility for ramping that up even further, drawing in the United States, Europe, NATO in new and unwanted ways, let's say.
First of all, if either of you want to comment on how you understand Assad's strategy and what he's trying to achieve, and in particular on the timing now, you could feel free. Avi, I wanted to talk to you about the opposition, what this means for the opposition. Michael talked about how refugees have been internal displaced people have been flooding to Idlib. It's not a random collection. These are the people who fear the regime most. And the opposition groups that are active there are the ones that are, this is the core of the opposition to the regime. What do you think that this is going to mean for the opposition, this push into Idlib?
Well, first, thank you so much, Cameron. It's an honor to be here today with all of you. The opposition, I mean, we're talking about the last place where it's outside of the Assad regime controlled area, outside of the SDF controlled areas, and where the United States has presence in Syria.
The SDF being the Kurdish forces.
Yes, led by the Kurdish. Yes, yeah. Led by the Kurdish forces. For the Assad regime, and I do kind of want to touch base on what Michael was talking about in your first question. For the Assad regime and Russia, and obviously Iran, they do want to have the ability to take Idlib before there's any real negotiations, especially that they are struggling financially with the United States and the West, not willing to be putting any money to quote unquote reconstruct Syria, which is the request by Russia and Assad. And this is why they're going there now. Obviously, what Michael said was very, very true, that there's millions of people in that area that have been displaced multiple times throughout the war in Syria from other parts of the country, and most of whom are women and children. And this is a catastrophe on every level, humanitarian catastrophe. But in terms of the control that Assad wants to gain, the problem for Assad and for Russia and Iran is that the whole country is boiling. We're talking right now about Syria, that it is basically on the verge, if not already, in an economical collapse. So that it's true that maybe Assad will eventually take Idlib. I'm not sure this is going to happen, but even if we assume they do succeed in doing and being able to take over Idlib, the situation is so dire in Syria that people under the Assad regime control, cities such as Damascus or Aleppo, are so angry and are actually more anti-Assad than people who became refugees throughout the years. I have friends who visit Syria, and the last few times they visited, they talked about devastating situations when people are, the vast majority of the entire country are actually very, very poor. They don't have enough money to eat. So, even though this is controlled by the opposition, and it's true that a lot of, the dominant force in Idlib is the HTS, which was a formerly affiliated group with Al-Qaeda. But the entire country is basically boiling under the surface, and I would actually argue that it's anti-Assad today, the vast majority of the people inside of Syria, and that would include the Alawites who are angry at Iran. And I think that's another layer that we can talk about in a moment.
Charles, let's talk about Turkey for a moment. Again, if you want to contribute to either of these other questions, feel free. But if you look at Turkey, Turkey's had, I think, multiple, and to a certain point, it's a problem for them to reconcile both their agendas. But on the one hand, to push the SDF, the mostly Kurdish forces, away from their border to create a buffer zone, and then second of all, to try to prevent the influx. But in order to do this, it's coming into a clash, a very severe clash in the last few weeks with Syria and Russia. If that clash continues to boil over, and you've seen dozens and dozens of Turk and Syrian soldiers killed, the first real fighting between two countries here in that way, where do you think that this could go? And in particular, how far will Turkey be willing to take this if it leads to open conflict with Russia?
So As with my other panelists, Cameron, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Is this working? And it's a really encouraging sign to see a room full of packed full of people who want to hear about Syria. Elsewhere in DC, I'm not finding that as much as being the trend. So thank you for being here and for listening and in the future engaging with us in about half an hour, I guess. On your question to Turkey, on Turkey, I think one of the reasons why the recent conflagration between Turkey and Syria, Turkey and Russia too, by the way, and the reason why we haven't seen that until now is because until now, primarily Turkey and Russia have been willing to essentially divvy up territory in terms of their respective priorities. It has until now been in Russia's interests and in Damascus's interests to see Turkey intervene against the SDF. To weaken the SDF, to degrade the SDF's relationship with America and with the counter-ISIS coalition. And this is the first area of territory where, yes, the SDF has no role, and therefore they actually have divergent interests. And until a week or two ago, Turkey was essentially being bullied, subjugated into submission in Idlib. And we've seen them essentially reach a breaking point. Really, that came on Thursday night when at least 36 Turkish soldiers were killed in a Russian strike, not a Syrian one, despite Turkey's claims. They've quite clearly blamed it on the Syrian regime as a way to try to de-escalate with the Russian government. But laser-guided demolition, otherwise bunker buster bombs, were used in that strike. The Syrian regime just doesn't have those capabilities. So that was a very calculated Russian strike that killed several dozen Turkish soldiers, followed by a Turkish request to allow their helicopters to enter into Idlib to evacuate the wounded and the dead, all of which were rejected by the Russian military command center. Again, they had to drive an hour through a war zone to evacuate their wounded, in trucks and pickup trucks belonging to ordinary civilians. This was a very calculated Russian move, aiming, I think, in their view, to force Turkey to surrender Idlib. But we've seen exactly the opposite happen. Why? Primarily because of domestic political considerations in Turkey. For Erdogan, the fate of Idlib, the fate of 3.5 million Syrians inside Idlib, is an existential political issue for his political survival in Turkey. He will not be re-elected in Turkey's next elections if a huge number of IDPs turn into refugees crossing across from the Syrian to Turkey border. He cannot allow that to happen. And that's why we've seen Turkey lash out in the way that it has over the last few days with an unprecedented air campaign, one almost entirely run by drones, which I think is an almost entirely unprecedented military development globally, a drone-led campaign, which over the last few days has had a very significant impact. We don't need to get into that detail, but a really very significant.
Well, just one quick question. Are they hitting Russian targets? If the Russians are hitting them, are they trying to hit back at the Russians?
Until now, they've only hit Syrian regime targets, which again is a reason why the Turks still hope to negotiate with the Russians on this bilaterally. But by weakening the Syrian regime, Turkey thinks it will be in a better position to negotiate. But they've sustained a very significant air campaign, and ultimately they want to make a deal. At the end of this week, Erdogan will be meeting Putin, and I imagine we will have some form of an outline of an agreement that will come up. That means this week's going to be very bloody. And we've already seen that today in terms of the conflict in Idlib. I just want to say a few things about Idlib big picture, just to sort of re-emphasize the scale of the crisis in Idlib. Again, it's not just unprecedented in 9 years of war in Syria. This is unprecedented in modern history. In at least the last 40 years, we haven't seen a humanitarian crisis of this scale develop this quickly. In 85 days, 1 million people were displaced from their homes and fled to a border where 1 million people are already in IDP camps and sleeping in open fields. So we now have effectively 2 million people squashed on the Turkish border.
And it's cold.
And it's
Winter.
cold. At least 7 children have frozen to death. Families who are forced to try and seek some form of warmth are suffocating because they're burning coal fires inside makeshift tents, and they're suffocating to death. So the humanitarian crisis, in terms of scale and rapidity, is unprecedented. The United Nations is totally overwhelmed. And there is at least, I think, 80,000 people who literally have no shelter whatsoever, who are just sleeping in open fields. And so there is that angle of it. The second angle is they have nowhere else to go. Every other military campaign we've seen in the news headlines over the last few years in Syria has resulted in a deal called reconciliation, whereby some people surrender to the regime and others are allowed to flee somewhere else. There is nowhere else to flee from Idlib. There is a shut border, and they're surrounded by enemy territories. And this is also why the humanitarian crisis that's still to come will be so much worse. And then beyond that, I just want to really emphasize Havi's points. The rest of Syria is not in a good place. The war in Syria is not over, it's changing. In Deraa, in the south of the country, in very close proximity to Israel, we have seen for the first time in 18 months open pitched battles between a resumed opposition insurgency and the regime. There were tanks and artillery seeking to regain control of towns that were taken over yesterday morning in Deraa. That's just one place. In the center of Syria, ISIS is resurgent. 10 Syrian soldiers were killed there yesterday by ISIS. It doesn't hit any of the media headlines in Syria or internationally. So the war is still going, and Syria is going nowhere good in the future. So we have to keep our attention on this issue.
Let's keep going with that thread about ISIS and other Islamist terrorist groups. The casual observer, again, would probably look at what's happening in Syria and think that the threat of ISIS is pretty much done, that all the al-Qaeda offshoots are pretty much history, and that especially as this campaign in Idlib may press on, this may be the end of that. And both the two, you, Michael, and Charles, both of you have independently come to the exact opposite conclusion. I think Havi agrees with this as well, that we are nowhere near that point. I'd like to get into this a bit. Havi, first of all, let's just take for a second the ISIS fighters in Kurdish control. Mm-hmm. How many fighters are there? And if the Kurds are trying to deal with a Turkish invasion, are they going to be able to hold on to these guys that are in their jails? And if not, what does that mean?
Well, as Charles also mentioned, not only that there are 12,000 ISIS detainees at SDF prisons, 3,000 of whom are foreigners, not Syrians, mostly Europeans. But we're talking about the resurgence of ISIS in other areas. And I think this is encouraged by the lack of American commitment to stay in Syria. Unfortunately, when the United States is not committed to stay, and the SDF are weakened due to that, you see a resurgence of ISIS elements, extremist elements, and the other elements which are, we see also pro-Assad, pro-Iran elements that are on the rise in these areas, which is very dangerous because Iran does need the land bridge that goes from these areas on the Iraqi borders. So this is definitely very dangerous. The EU, European countries need to be taking their ISIS fighters back to have fair trials in their countries. The SDF cannot do it on their own. And as you said, Turkey, unfortunately, has prioritized fighting the Kurds rather than fighting Assad or the extremist elements. And I do want to kind of go back to Charles' point. And I know that Charles doesn't like when people go back on the Turkey issue because you kind of commented on that on your Twitter feed, because I follow you on Twitter. So the story is that when you look at the Idlib situation and the situation in Syria, we have to understand that there is years in the making of what we are seeing today. For example, when you talked about why is the world basically not thinking about the price of inaction, well, according to a high-level State Department official recently in an off-the-records meeting, he talked about how Turkey was basically refusing to talk to the United States about anything that has to do with Idlib. But other than that, they would only ask the United States to leave Syria as the first Turkish priority, and that's since 2018 when President Trump warned Russia and the Assad regime of not going into Idlib. So basically the Turkish priority was in line with the Assad, Iran, and the Russian priority in Syria. And Turkey has the largest borders on Syria. It's a major country. And unfortunately, also Turkey allowed to have extremist elements become the dominant force on its borders, which is Idlib. And many people from the opposition, they asked Turkey, and then some people were actually defeated by Turkish-backed elements within the northern part of Syria. So this was a problem that Turkey basically oversaw, and when they wanted to interfere, instead of doing something about Idlib, which was a time bomb, they chose to attack the Kurds. And what we saw is ethnic cleansing in many parts, including, Ras Al Ain, 1,800 or 18,000. 180,000 people became refugees. They were pushed out of their areas. And then in other areas, there was 300,000 people that were displaced because they were Kurds. And this is something that we saw with Turkey. Do we actually support what Turkey is doing right now? And do we want to find a solution? And I'm sorry I am talking about the situation in Idlib because I think it's a very important point to focus on. We do want to work with Turkey on confronting Assad in Russia, if possible. However, I'm pretty pessimistic because Turkey has had a very close relationship to Russia, and we saw a shift in Ankara towards Russia in the last many years away from NATO and from the United States. So yes, we do want to support Turkey in what it's doing right now in Idlib, but we also want to focus on trying to maybe bring Turkey back to becoming a NATO ally, including the S-400 deal with Russia, where the United States should definitely not give any other American weaponry to a country that is getting close to an American adversary. And the SDF is definitely a very important player in Syria that needs support by the United States and a commitment. And I definitely encourage that this is something where the U.S. could play a major role and could definitely prevent the comeback of ISIS, which will be a threat to us and to our allies throughout the region.
Charles, do you want to relate to those points? Or the other part about this, again, is how defeated are ISIS and all the offshoot movements? And you've got a really important piece that I encourage people to read. It gets pretty deep in the weeds about how Al-Qaeda localized, and I would call it broken. It broke in Syria. It's a fascinating article about what happened with all the offshoots. So can you talk about what is the state of those two movements? Are they really on the rocks, or do you think that this is just a phase and that they've got another phase yet to come?
Sure. So, I mean, it's a really important question, and I think it will get to, or my answer will try and get to, I think, what the root of a lot of these problems are. And that is, first of all, the plainly obvious answer is no, ISIS isn't defeated. It is finding it harder to resurge in US SDF-controlled territories. There's no doubt about that. Although it is sustaining a low-level guerrilla insurgency, which is something. But in the regime-controlled territories where ISIS has historically operated, even prior to 2011, we're talking about the central desert of Syria, the Badia region.
By the way, if you guys want to open up your phones and get a map of Syria,
by all means, have a look. Right in the middle of the country.
It's not a bad idea. We won't think you're all looking at your phones because you're checking your email.
So it's right in the middle of the country, the central desert, as the name would suggest. This is a very sparsely populated region of the country, but with a very critical highway that runs right through the middle. A large conglomeration of gas facilities, which are existentially important for Syria and the economy going forward. And ISIS is very clearly resurging there. Killing multiple Syrian soldiers almost on a daily basis, not being publicized by Syrian media, but you can pick up on this on pro-regime Facebook pages that publicize their martyrdom, their deaths in the military. And so just yesterday, 10 soldiers were killed. The day before that, 3 were killed. And this is almost a daily occurrence. So ISIS is very clearly still a very capable actor. And on the other side of this is the Al-Qaeda piece of the equation. And I won't go into the weeds because I'd need an hour to do that. But The short story is both Al-Qaeda and ISIS have a future in Syria because of the complexity and ambiguities that Havey was addressing. I think maybe not necessarily on purpose, but US strategy has been ambiguous and contradictory since 2011 in Syria. Turkey's policy has been ambiguous and contradictory since 2011 in Syria, and you can name every single country that has been involved in Syria and pretty much use that same phrase. And the result of that is total strategic chaos, no consistency. And in that kind of an environment, extremists in particular will always thrive. They will always find local drivers, local routes. And I think with both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and looking today and also in years past, we need to get our heads out of the world where only ideology drives these movements, because they don't. Back in 2013 and 14, when ISIS started to explode in scale in Syria, it wasn't because of their ideology. It was because primarily locals in that early phase were willing to join it. Again, not because they agreed with the ideology, but because ISIS, to them, in their local environments, presented a more favorable alternative to all of the other options they had at the table. And I worry that because Turkey and the US and Iran and Russia and Israel and all these countries are all pointing in a different direction and from time to time clash, we're going to have an environment that is continuously beneficial for the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And to briefly address some of your points, Turkey undoubtedly has had an interest, a self-interest, in sustaining chaos on its borders, in backing any opposition actor that was able to keep the regime away from its borders, and then more recently in negotiating with Russia. Why? Because America has not taken the opposition regime conflict seriously since at least 2016, and Russia was the only other actor willing to negotiate and able to implement things on the ground. That's not me saying from an American perspective that's a good thing. It's a terrible thing for the United States, but that's why we've seen Turkey go down that path. The other reason kind of goes without saying. Our primary partner on the ground, going back to 2014 when we intervened against ISIS, is and has and continues to be described by the US government, you have to look for it, as a terrorist organization. We can't get away from that. They've done an immensely good job at fighting against ISIS. We certainly can't get away from that either. But from a Turkish perspective, from a purely Turkish perspective, the Americans came into Syria, built up their existential national security threat to fight another national security threat, and suddenly the PKK, their 40-year enemy, held the vast majority of their border and had the protection of the world's biggest superpower. It's kind of no surprise that Turkey lashed out, stupidly, illogically, all along a path that caused it more trouble. Yes, absolutely, but none of that should have been any surprise to us. There were many of us writing about this going to have an inevitable cost, going all the way back to 2014.
But I think the U.S. would counter that there was no other partner.
Yes, true too. Yeah, absolutely.
We have, unfortunately, and I saw there's a hand up. We'll get to the questions from the audience in a bit. Two last things, and we'll open it up, and maybe we'll even just make this one, because there's a ton, again, to talk about. We could talk about Russia, and I think maybe I'll leave Russia for the audience to ask about. Let's just talk about Iran for 1 second here. Michael, if, there have been the former chief of staff of the IDF said that they had struck over 1,000 targets, over 1,000 Iranian targets in Syria in the last few years. And it's sort of like Sisyphus, where they have to roll the ball up and then it rolls down again and they go back to Iran and roll it back up. Why are the Iranians continuing? It's, I think, clear why they're backing Assad. Why do they keep trying so hard to build up their military capabilities vis-a-vis Israel, despite the fact that they keep getting destroyed all the time? What are they thinking?
Well, I think the Iranians have a pretty clear strategic purpose in mind in what they're doing in Syria and, frankly, in what they're doing in Yemen and Iraq. And in all the places we're seeing the Iranian military, the Revolutionary Guard Corps especially, the IRGC, operate. And I think what the Iranians want to do is they want to place their capabilities, their forces, their proxies, far forward, as we say, far away from their borders and close to their adversaries' borders, so that they can, number one, threaten those adversaries in case of conflict, but number two, keep those adversaries occupied far away from Iran. So that if you're Israel and you have any thought of bombing Iran, which is an issue which has just come up thanks to a talkative rabbi in the Israeli elections, you are instead fighting in Lebanon against Hezbollah. You're instead fighting on the Syrian front, which maybe diverts you from that potential attack on Iran. If you're Saudi Arabia, instead of thinking about how do I retaliate against Iran for this or that action, which they've undertaken, you find yourself consumed in a frankly fruitless war in Yemen against another Iranian, not proxy perhaps, but at least client, the Houthis. And remember, when Iran does this, they're taking perhaps the most reckless and destabilizing steps of any actor in the Middle East by proliferating to essentially local militias, these incredibly sophisticated weapons like anti-ship cruise missiles, very precise ballistic missiles, and we see that in Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere. For the Iranians consider this existential. They're not going to stop doing it. And their effort is not just a military effort. As Havey and Charles would tell you, there is also an economic, a political, a social aspect to this because they're looking to embed themselves deeply in these societies so that whoever might follow Assad, because Assad won't live forever, we can be sure of that, they will find it very difficult to decouple from that Iranian relationship, far more than they would decoupling from Russia or the United States or whoever the latest kind of external power meddling in Syria might be. That's why deterrence, as I think the Israelis know very well, but sometimes we forget in the United States, is not a one-off action. Deterrence is not an action, it's not a strike. Right. Deterrence is an ongoing policy which must constantly be prosecuted. So the Iranians won't stop trying to place sophisticated weapons, and every time they try, and the Israelis get intelligence, they will strike and destroy those weapons. But deterrence of that sort is hard to make work over time, because eventually there will be weapons that get through that dragnet, as we've seen in Lebanon. Stopping them will prove impossible over the long term. Right. And what then supplements that kind of routine deterrence is a broader, sort of more profound type of deterrence, where the adversary, in this case Iran and its proxies, knows that if they try to use those weapons, the cost will be a devastating cost. And that's behind what some of the rhetoric we see about Lebanon coming from Israel. So they won't stop. And we have to bear this in mind as well. And I'm going to depart from Syria for just a moment to talk about the Soleimani strike. We've talked about the Soleimani strike. What effect does it have on the Iranians? And I would say, remember that deterrence is not a one-shot action. Whatever effect it may have on Iran is going to be a temporary effect. And if they sense that we don't have the stomach to continue, trust me, they have the stomach to continue. The Israelis understand this. The Iranians understand it, which is why we see this ongoing campaign. And I think we'll see it for some time to come.
All right, let's open this up to questions from the audience.
Hi, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So what exactly does the U.S. care about that? And how do we really care about it, as opposed to, let's say, Iran, which I could see we are caring about?
Why should we care? I think, to be honest, this is part of the reason why when we think about American foreign policy across administrations here, the biggest problem, this goes back to Charles' opening point, is that we have a difficult time communicating to people in this country, why should we care? What's the threat? Why is ISIS and Al-Qaeda a threat?
Well, the simple answer is you can find lots of examples for why ISIS and Al-Qaeda should be a threat. The problem is since September 11th, the US has involved itself in a great deal of military interventions, military counterterrorism operations abroad. And as a result of nearly 20 years of those operations, Al-Qaeda and ISIS have grown, not shrunk. They are in more countries than they were in 2001. So it kind of poses us a very difficult question, because the threat continues. I would say, as someone who studies these organizations, is that they have become more intelligent, more smart, more flexible than they were in 2001. And that makes our challenge even more complicated. When I have policy discussions with the intelligence community and with counterterrorism specialists in the US government, the consensus ordinarily is if there's a threat to the US homeland, we care about it. If there is no threat to the US homeland, but terrorist organizations exist, but they're focused on their local environment, it's something that we can afford to not worry about. And I see the logic with that. Of course, we have We don't have limitless capabilities, limitless money. We certainly don't have domestic political support for being involved in hitting people or in every corner of the world. But the danger, I would just say here, in terms of focusing only on immediate threats to the homeland, is best explained in a place like Syria. The US policy on Idlib, going back to at least 2015, was it's an opposition regime conflict, it's messy, the Turks primarily have things under their iron fist and so our ability to influence events there are limited. There are terrorists there, but they're locally focused, so we don't need to be overly concerned about them. And the danger is that they have created, not they, the Americans, they, the terrorists, since 2014 and 15, they have now created an environment where they have incredibly deep roots. They're not necessarily locally supported, but they are locally credible. When the threat of an Assad regime massacre is imminent, people will fall behind this group because they are the most militarily capable of confronting the regime. And so our unwillingness to, in my opinion, back genuinely more moderate figures. And by the way, in Idlib, when we're talking about this area as jihadist controlled, first of all, it's not. It's much more complicated than that. But also, Idlib is where, in my opinion, civil society, mainstream, moderate Syrian civil society within the opposition, was most powerful, was most vibrant. And we allowed it, we contributed to allowing it to be taken over by extremists. But by doing that, we have something called a safe haven, where right now, and I'm not exactly sure if this is a public US position yet, but right now, our consensus in the US government is that the Al-Qaeda loyalists, so not the big group that is most dominant, but a smaller faction who are loyal to Al-Qaeda, now pose the most urgent threat of international or external terrorist attacks of any group in the world. They have just overtaken ISIS in terms of US intelligence estimates. And that's been allowed to happen because the world didn't invest in trying to promote alternatives or promote factions who were powerful enough to fight back against these extremists. So focusing only on an immediate threat to the homeland doesn't negate future threats, I guess is my answer.
I guess the first question is, where are we know where the Iranian-backed forces are getting their weapons because Iran's giving them to them, but where are the opposition forces actually getting their weapons from today? And the second question, I guess, is how do you see this all ending? Like, you know, as the learned counsel, how do you see this all ending?
Well, let's see, we've got 20 minutes left.
No, I actually wanted to talk about the other question, which is which
war?
one is more important, Iran or the Sunni extremists, and where our focus should be. And I think the answer to this is a simple answer. They are two faces of the same coin. Addressing Shia and Sunni extremism is exactly at the same level of importance. And I want to add that the Iranian regime has been actively supporting Sunni extremism. There are Al-Qaeda leaders today in Iran being protected, fed and clothed by the Iranian regime. Obviously, the Iranian regime supports Hezbollah, Hamas, which is a Sunni group, Islamic Jihad, which is another Sunni group. So, I mean, I would definitely focus on both at the same level, and will always go back to the fact that the Iranian regime is the head of the snake in terms of Islamic extremism, and the main focus should be there.
Okay, let's take some more questions. Nir.
I'd like comments from all the panelists, if possible. If you were the President of the United States, would you have withdrawn the troops recently, leaving the Kurds essentially undefended or lightly defended, given our connection with them as a reliable ally? I just would like your thoughts. What would you have done differently or not?
If I were the US president, well, there's so many things I would do, but
what would your first executive order be?
Look, I think that it was a mistake to do what President Trump did. And bear in mind, he didn't withdraw the troops. We have troops there today who have the kind of, frankly, farcical mission of securing the oil from President Trump's point of view. I think that those troops are playing a very important role. It was a case where we had really just a few hundred troops that managed to rally and then work with a partner force, tens of thousands strong, to not defeat ISIS, I think that's the wrong terminology, but to drive ISIS out of the territory which it had managed to recapture and create an environment where something else could be built. Something could be built that could maybe sustainably crowd out ISIS. We made two mistakes. One was by never really committing to that small troop presence. We should have said, we are willing to keep these troops here for the long term to help our partners. President Trump made clear that he wanted them out, but he never really got them out. It's a twofold mistake. One, he should have committed to it. Second, we shouldn't have Americans in harm's way to secure the oil. That's not a good reason to put Americans in harm's way. And sending those troops out there with such a flimsy mission that doesn't clearly have support from Washington is, I think, a disservice to our troops. Second, we made a mistake in not transitioning to a more political, more economically focused policy in northeastern Syria. Once ISIS had largely been driven out of northeastern Syria, really the State Department should have been put in front. USAID, our development agency, should have been put in front with the military supporting them to really help our local forces, our local partners in northeastern Syria to build something up, even if it's not a state, but something autonomous and so forth. And I didn't, but the group that I chaired, the Syria Study Group, detailed a lot of this in a report to Congress in September. Now, a week after we put out this report to Congress, where our #1 recommendation was don't withdraw the troops, President Trump tweeted that he was going to withdraw the troops. So you can tell the impact that we had on his thinking.
President Obama was criticized for making a promise that if a red line was crossed, the use of chemical weapons, that there would have been serious ramifications for that conduct. Of course, it happened. The red line was crossed, and he backed off. I mean, with the benefit of the hindsight of history, assume for the moment that Barack Obama had reacted and, let's say, dropped a bomb on the presidential palace, assuming it was, for sure unoccupied. Would that have been a message that would have resonated, made a difference or not, so that we can kind of put to bed whether that decision really would have had an impact one way or the other? Thank you.
Look, I think that it was a watershed moment for sure in U.S. policy towards Syria. We had been very indecisive up to that point. But I think that really crystallized in the minds of so many parties that the United States really wasn't going to be a major actor in Syria. And it wasn't so much the lack of a bomb being dropped on the presidential palace. I don't know what impact that would have had in itself. It was what followed. What followed was this kind of process sort of to take out the chemical weapons, good in itself. But if you think that the presence of chemical weapons was the big problem we had in Syria, you just weren't paying attention. And it was a fig leaf for us to do nothing. And that is what ultimately brought the Russians in. And ever since the Russians have come in, the whole tenor and nature of this conflict from the United States perspective has been changed. That, I think, was the consequence of inaction back then.
I agree entirely with Michael's first and second points, actually. I would add to the second one on the Red Line incident that August 2013 was a long time ago. Totally different world in Syria then. The United States was about 8 months into the CIA's huge program of supporting local moderate factions of the armed opposition. And 8 months in, it was having a huge effect. I remember studying this on a very tiny root level where we went nationwide from over 1,000 armed factions to about 90 within a year. That was almost entirely due to an American-led effort to coalesce the mainstream part of the opposition, make them more efficient, and then provide them arms to have an impact on the ground. From January to August 2013, our allies on the ground were playing leading roles in militarily threatening the regime. I was in a meeting with dozens of the leaders of those groups when it was announced that the United States wasn't going to do anything in response to a chemical weapons attack that killed 1,400 people in about half an hour. And about 2/3 of the room were US-backed factions, and about 1/3 were more Islamist factions, not designated terrorist organizations, but Islamist nevertheless, or too Islamist for the US to back. And it was, you could, first of all, when someone announced it around the table, you could have heard a pin drop. And within about an hour or two, the Islamists in the room started to become incredibly dismissive of our allies around the table. Like, not just that they didn't matter anymore, whereas 2 hours earlier they were all allies. Not only that they didn't matter, that they were a disgrace. They shouldn't be at the table. They didn't stand for the revolution. They had sided with the United States, who had betrayed the morality, the ethics, and the Syrian cause. And that the effect of that decision continued to spiral. Within weeks, alliances all across the country had disappeared, had dissolved between our factions and others. And within a year or so, almost all of our allies were of negligible importance on the battlefield. Then started the phase of Islamists and jihadists taking over and playing a dominant role in Syria. So from a military, just from a purely military perspective, it was catastrophic. Really quickly on the moderate opposition. They get their weapons from Turkey and from the regime. The latter might sound a little bit strange. They get a significant amount of weapons from fighting the regime and taking over their positions and raiding their arms depots. But there is also a thriving black market in trading weapons between the regime and the opposition. That goes on to this day. They fight each other on the battlefield and they sell each other weapons to make money. There is a reason why people talk about warlordism as being a future for Syria. All of the pro-regime's most significant armed commanders are millionaires because they get their weapons from the Russians and from Damascus and sell them to the regime and to Al-Qaeda. And that has a significant role to play in sustaining the conflict that we see. So again, speaking to all of the various ambiguities and illogical areas of what's going on, that's just one of many.
Maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of want to just talk about what happened in 2000, when Obama basically decided not to enforce the red line. That was a disaster on every level, including to the United States as the world leading power. Because what we saw is that not only the United States lost its credibility, but we saw that other bad elements and bad forces kind of came into the region, including Iran and following that, Russia. So I was in the United States. I talked to friends of mine who are at the State Department at the time, and I was like, this is the recipe where another terrorist group is going to be on the rise. And they reminded me of that later. They were like, hey, you said that a long time ago, and that was before ISIS basically became the most powerful terrorist group and attacked the United States and Americans and other civilians all over the world. So, this it was a devastating decision that had many implications, and we saw that Iran became the dominant force in all, basically Iraq, Syria. I mean, Iraq was sort of, but also Obama withdrew from Iraq. So Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Hezbollah became so much more powerful, and now Hezbollah dominates the Lebanese parliament. The army infiltrated the army. That's why there's an argument that I actually support too, that the United States should not be supporting the Lebanese army as long as Hezbollah is the dominant force there. And we know that Syria is basically completely compromised, and we saw now even with the Turkish airstrikes against the Assad regime, we saw that immediately there was 9 members of Hezbollah that were killed, announced by Hezbollah. We expect that the numbers probably are higher, but that shows us the level of dependency of the Assad regime on the Iranian-backed militias. And now there's also another battlefield that's happening with another Iranian-backed militia in Syria leading the fight in northern Syria today against the Turks. So, I mean, basically it was devastating because the whole region was compromised, and the Islamic extremist forces became the most powerful ones, and Russia today became a dominant force in the region, which was not the case prior to the Obama administration and his decisions to basically withdraw from the region. About the SDF forces and the areas that now President Trump basically did not show the commitment of the United States, which is very needed to basically defeat extremist elements in the region. There are many issues that related to that, not only only in terms of keeping American military presence in these areas, but also supporting education, which is another way of combating extremism. We're talking about schools today where there's a 13-year-old boys who were deprived from going to schools during ISIS control times, and now they are in first grade classes with other students who are 7 years old, which does not give the trust to the parents in the school system. They also cannot have certificates. They cannot have high school diplomas. That only also compromises the education process, which is very important in combating extremism. So the American commitment affects many parts of the situation in those areas, and having some sort of civil society organizations working on the ground in these areas, including Raqqa, which was the former capital of ISIS, is crucial to maintaining and basically continuing our war that is still happening against ISIS in Syria.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a small problem. It's 3:15. We have a bunch of people who'd like to ask questions, and I'm going to unfortunately have to disappoint you and suggest that you just come forward, and after we're done with our session, come and ask the questions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists. And thank you very much. Take care.
Yes, sure.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.